Welcome to another episode of The Modern Moron. A lot more God talk in this one, people, which you may or may not be into. A lot of philosophical and theological perspectives on God with a capital G. We continue our conversation with a very interesting seminarian who has been studying not only theology, but philosophy as well, so he used big words, make brain thing hurtey. This recording dates back to August of 2022, and I'm just now getting to it. My friend, the seminarian, was in a summer program of chaplaincy at the hospital where I do some volunteer work. We've had some interesting conversations, and I finally connected with him to be on this show. We start out with a simple question. If God is all-loving, how can there be so much hatred among us? That's an easy one, right? However, if you're looking for an answer to that question, you'll need to visit another podcast. But, inevitably, the answer to all questions can be found in a podcast. A few glossary terms referred to in this episode. The eternal now. It feels to me like I'm hearing more and more about this referred to as maybe mindfulness and mindfulness meditations, but to a Catholic seminarian, it is much more. It is his desire to be as present to God as he is present to us. This also sent me down a crazy rabbit hole that led me to a site called faithhub.net. FaithHub. Doesn't that sound tasty? Like Grubhub, only they deliver faith right to your door. There is a post on that site titled God's Eternal Now. It reads, God is present here and now in each moment. It is our greatest desire to be present to God as he is present to us. It is we who are often missing from the moment and therefore are often out of touch with God. Now, even if you take God out of the equation, and please do if you have a negative association with that word for now, just remove it. Take it out of the equation, and most reasonable and thoughtful people would see the value of being in the moment. That's why people meditate. That's why people practice meditation. Yoga gets to that. All kinds of stuff that's popular right now. And that, regardless of faith, we spend way too much time regretting or reliving the past and fretting about the future. I know I do. And there really isn't much value to it. Other than, of course, the satisfaction I get out of having a winning drop-the-mic argument with a fictitious person I've never met in a situation that will never occur.
Get on your knees, scumbag!
Back to the article on FaithHub, and get ready for the rabbit hole because it led me to a previous rabbit hole, that being author C.S. Lewis. Remember a few episodes ago I told you I thought he wrote Alice in Wonderland, but it was actually Lewis Carroll? Well, this time it is C.S. Lewis I'm interested in. Lewis is an author of novels filled with Christian metaphor, and before he wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he wrote a novel called The Screwtape Letters, which was dedicated to his friend J.R.R. Tolkien. The Screwtape Letters was published as a list of letters from a senior demon or devil named Screwtape to a lower-level devil. Do you like that, lower-level devil? Named Wormwood. Screwtape and Wormwood. Sounds like J.K. Rowling snatched a couple of names up and twisted them around a little bit, doesn't it? Wormwood is actually the nephew of Screwtape, and Screwtape advises Wormwood on how to treat his patient. The patient is an earthly being, so as to get that patient, get him over to the dark side. Wormwood tells Screwtape, quote, our business is to get them, meaning mortals, away from the eternal and from the present. He also tells Wormwood that if the human, quote, concerns himself with the present, because there, and there alone, all duty, grace, knowledge, all pleasure dwell, his state is very undesirable and should be attacked at once. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. This all gets back to the eternal now our seminarian tells us about in this episode. Didn't you enjoy that ridiculous rabbit hole? Next glossary term, Boethius. He was a Roman senator and Christian scholar in the early Middle Ages when Rome was embracing Christianity, and he wrote and translated a bunch of texts. There's your moron definition for that. Next, we talk about how to pray for someone and give them their money's worth. There's something to that. It has to do with the length of the prayer a little bit, in my opinion. Also, we learned the origin of the term scapegoat. You guys probably already know, especially you Catholics and Christians, but I haven't a clue. He also tells us who the all-time scapegoat is. Here's a hint. The goat is not Tom Brady. Also a note, There is a graphic description of death and dying in this episode that you may not feel comfortable hearing, specifically involving a patient dying from cancer. With that same patient, there is a discussion about the power of forgiveness, which leads me to bring up a professor I have mentioned before on this podcast, Dr. Fred Luskin from Stanford University. He has done extensive research on the training and measurement of forgiveness therapy. His research demonstrates that learning forgiveness leads to increased physical vitality, hope, enhanced optimism, and conflict resolution skills. It also shows that forgiveness lessens the physical and emotional toll of stress and decreases hurt, anger, depression, and blood pressure. There is a link at the bottom of the description to a short talk by Dr. Luskin. We pick up our conversation right where we left off last time. In fact, there's a slight overlap as our guest was talking about the literal versus figurative when trying to interpret the Bible. It's my conversation with a seminarian and his chaplaincy work in a hospital. And thank you for listening to The Modern Moron.
Catholic theology, and this is something really confusing to me, we do this play between literal and metaphorical all the time. And we're constantly having to think about, all right, are we saying this literally?
Because we're trying to give words to something that is way beyond words, but words are all we have.
That's precisely it. That's a very Platonic thought, by the way, if I was to slap a philosophical title to it. The fact that God is so far beyond, infinitely beyond, we can barely even approach to speak about him.
And yet people are plenty willing to do it in his name.
Oh, I'll tell you what, we certainly do.
Yeah.
But something interesting about Jewish theology, though, a lot of Jewish theology uses something called negative theology, where they proceed by describing God of what he is not. And so you would say God is nothing but greatness. God is nothing but infinity. Well, we can at least be sure that God is not evilness. So that implies that you can then say, well, then that must mean God is good. But to even say that God is good in using human terms and our human understanding, we cannot even begin to imagine what that looks like.
You're saying God is everything?
If I was to describe, if you were to say that...
If you're saying God is everything, then, and there is evil, how do you come to grips with that?
How do you reconcile those two parts? Yeah.
Or do you? Do you bother even try?
Well, I can approach it from a philosophical perspective. I can approach it from a theological perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes down to it, it can become a very personal experience of how that is approached. I can say you have Boethius in the early centuries of the church, who was this philosopher turned theologian, I guess he was both, I'd say, describing what does it mean for us to have freedom, but for God's will to always happen. How does that work? If we have free will and we have the freedom to choose, then how is it that God's will always comes to take place? And there's this sense of God viewing everything in the eternal now, and here we are choosing in the midst of that eternal now from God's perspective. But when you look at the problem of evil, then, if you wanted to go to a theological standpoint, you look at our foundation of why evil has come to pass, ultimately came from an act of love from God. Now, if God was to say, I've made creation and I truly love them, then, at least in our understanding, the best way for God to truly love them is to give them the freedom to say, I love you back. And so then God gave us the freedom to choose whether to love God or to not love God. And in the Christian and Judeo-centric style of understanding, we're talking about Genesis here, when you have Adam and Eve, and in the garden they were tempted by the devil and broke down, and Adam and Eve sinned. And here we have sin entering the world. And then from there, this cascading series of events occurred that we describe as salvation history, where you look at from the beginning moment to the moment when Jesus Christ came, and to think about where were all the moments where we're just falling lower and lower and lower into sin, and we're suddenly seeing the consequences of one sin lead into another and lead into another, lead into another. That has resulted in war and famine and hatred and evil all around us wherever we look. And we think to ourselves, well, why would a good God allow that? How could a good God allow that? If God is all good and if God is all loving, how could he allow so much suffering
Why would that
and so
be
much evil
his
in the world?
will? His or her will? How, I just say God's. How could God have that will?
Yeah.
How could God will that? To what end? Learning?
To what end? To what end is interesting, especially if we think about in looking then at the Gospels back to a Judeo and Christian background of looking at how God has kept the Hebrew people in line, giving them a particular amount of boundaries that you call the law, leading them through the desert where their obstinance kept causing them to sin over and over again, where they arrived to this place where God says, I want you to be with me, I want you to rest. There's this sense of unity that God keeps calling us to, the sense of desire that God wants to be with us, that you can read into the scriptures very easily, of God constantly calling his people back into union. What does it mean to be in the presence of God? Well, to the Jews, it meant to live right all the days of your life, to follow the law of God, because not only did it come from God, but that means the more you're following God, the closer you are to God. And so if we were to then look at the life of Jesus as portrayed in the Gospels, suddenly we see something very similar. Jesus constantly calling all of humanity back from a certain amount of sin and all sin to say, hey, I have something so much better. I have something that will give happiness and lasting peace.
Better than what?
Well, better than, well, look around you, better than hatred, better
But I
than
mean,
war.
better than,
We're talking about.
when you said that, I have something better, it made me think better than what the Jewish faith was advocating.
I will. Well, no, better in the context
Okay.
of the situation. Better in the context of the situation, because if to think about the words that Jesus was saying, what Jesus was saying, that to a certain degree, the Jews themselves, even though they said they followed the law, were no longer following the law. And so Jesus presented his words as the new interpretation of the law.
Okay.
And this new interpretation of the law, if you were to consistently follow the law, would lead to this understanding of a sacrifice, of atonement that eventually has to be made. In Jewish theology, it's very interesting to see, what does atonement look like? You know, we have the phrase the scapegoat.
Mm-hmm.
The scapegoat came from Jewish theology, where they would whisper the sins of the people in the ears of a goat and then drive the goat out to be exiled out of the camp. And then you have Passover, where the offerings and sin offerings were made so that the priest would be cleansed. And then after that, they would then offer sacrifice to God in honor of God. And so suddenly Jesus comes around and says, well, I will be that sacrifice to end all of the sacrifice.
So he did it all for the goats.
Let me tell you, all the goats, all the doves, all the lambs,
Well,
and for us too, thanks be
metaphor,
God.
we're all lambs, right? That's the 23rd Psalm, right? Where Lord is my shepherd. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that one too.
That's the one I'm trying to learn, because that seems to be a really popular one in hospitals.
Yeah, it is. A lot of people take a lot of comfort in that. I've learned to sing it as well. I've learned to sing it.
Oh, really? Oh,
That's
okay.
very nice. Song has a certain way of opening up an expression of emotions a little
I
more
would
easily.
say I'm not a huge prayer person. I've said this before on this podcast, but I'm not a type of person that prays a lot. But I did notice in the first, I don't know, few weeks, first month or so of volunteering, that at one point I was saying a prayer, holding someone's hand, saying a prayer. It was not about me at all. I wasn't praying for myself. I wasn't praying for a family member. I wasn't praying for anyone I knew. I was just praying for this other person and their family. There was definitely, I don't want to say it was a spiritual moment, but it felt very different. God, please give me health, and please give me, like Jim Morrison said, you must petition the Lord with prayer. Well, I'm sure it was said before that, but it's very different feeling when you're praying for someone else.
Yeah,
You've had that experience, obviously.
a whole bunch of times. And I'm praying for all people of all
Mm-hmm.
faiths right here when I'm sitting down with them. And I'm trying to offer them a little bit of solace. And suddenly I'm thinking to myself, I don't know the right words that are going to give
Right.
comfort to this person. I don't know what I'm going to do.
Do you ever feel like, I have this feeling sort of like if I'm going to say a prayer for somebody, it needs to sort of be, it has to be sincere. I don't have a problem with the sincerity, but it has to be a certain length. Like if I wrap it up too quick, it's like, really? That's it? And you can also go on a little too long,
Yeah,
right?
I agree. I agree.
I mean, there's some practical experience
I
to
think,
say a prayer for
yeah, there
somebody.
is.
Can you give me some advice on that? Because I need, or maybe it's just
Yeah.
experience. I haven't said,
It could be experience, but I mean, as much as you know, I'm a pretty young guy without much experience at all, and so I'm still trying to figure this out. I got to tell you. But I have found though, I have found that I'm going into a room, and before I pray, I really want to get to know
mm-hmm,
the person, and I want to get to know their needs and their wants, their desires, their dreams. It could be one thing or another. I met this one person who's dying, and I said, "Hey, let's talk about it." And I spent about an hour and a half with this person, and I'm leading them through a dying exercise. I'm asking all these questions to a person who's dying, and they're in a lot of pain. So we're going to stop every once in a while, and
mm-hmm,
he's going to grimace, and he goes through this moment. And I'm not giving up.
mm-hmm.
I'm going to be there with him for this moment. And I was just asking him, how are your relationships? How do you think you lived your life? Do you think you've done good? Do you think you've done evil? Did you want to do better? Is there a relationship that you wish you could heal? Can I
Mm-hmm.
facilitate that for you? And at the end, I said, what would you like to pray for? And every single prayer was for other people and not for himself.
That's a good sign, right?
And I said,
Generally.
well, it was very interesting that this guy's preparing for death. And I thought to myself, he's going to pray for peace. He's going to pray for courage. He's going to
Mm-hmm,
pray for
mm-hmm.
perseverance, whatever it may be, to end the
Was it
suffering
just
and
the two of
something.
you? Or was the family there as well?
No, the family had just left. The family had just
Oh,
left.
so it was one-on-one time. That's kind of special.
It was one on one.
Yeah.
Yeah, to be with the guy. And he looked into my eyes, and I
Uh-huh.
was looking into his, and he just said, I'm dying. And that's how we began the conversation.
He said, "I'm dying."
I'm dying. And then he showed me his scars, and he has
Mm-hmm.
cancer in his stomach. So he can't eat or drink anything. And there's what's it called?
Colostomy
Cholestectomy
bag.
bag?
Colostomy bag.
Is that
Yeah.
what it is? Colostomy bag.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. He's got a
Mm-hmm.
colostomy bag on one side. And then another side, I don't remember the term, maybe you do. It's the where you have a tube connected to
I
the
don't.
stomach as well.
Oh, to feed a feeding tube?
I don't remember it. No, not a feeding tube. It was for all the
Oh, to
stomach
come
acid that
out.
was
Oh
coming out.
God, I have no idea.
And it was a mixture of blood and stomach acid and other bodily
Yeah.
fluids. And I looked down and I asked him the question. I said, what do you feel when you see all these fluids coming out? And he said, I just feel my life pouring out from me.
Really?
And I thought to myself, I'm pretty young. I don't know what that
Mm-hmm.
feels like. What can I offer this guy? And I thought to myself, I really can't offer him much, but I'll tell you what I am going to try and do. I'm going to hold his hand,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to offer some sort of experience that can give him peace and closure in this life before he moves on.
Even though you have no clue what that is specifically, you just know you're not leaving.
I have no idea how this is going to turn out. I don't leave him. And there were several moments where he said, thank you for coming. I really
Mm-hmm.
appreciate this. And I said,
Mm-hmm.
you're welcome. But I didn't leave at that moment. I didn't take that as a symbol
Mm-hmm.
for me to leave, and I stuck with it. And we ended after an hour and a half with him saying, I just went through my whole life. I just had no idea that these memories were still there. And he brought up a lot of painful stories.
Mm.
One of the situations was his father, and he said his dad was a preacher who had 9 women who didn't know each other, and he had kids with all those 9 women.
Hmm.
And all around the United States, this guy would preach, and this guy would have some sort of hidden relationship with another woman, and they'd move on. And so this was the patient's
Mhm.
father, mind you. And when he was a young child, his mother told him, the patient's mother told him when she was dying, when you were a child, your father threw you up into the ceiling, and it caused you to put a crack in your skull that went down from the crown of the forehead down through the nose. And that they thought it was just a broken nose, but it turned out to cause a whole series of problems with a hematoma and fluid building up in the brain,
This was an
to
accident, I
something of an
presume.
aneurysm.
This was an accident?
He looked at me.
Oh, my God.
His father would physically abuse him in other situations and verbally abuse him. And he looked at me and he said, "You know what? I forgive him."
Mm.
And to see the weight lift off this guy's shoulders.
So you feel that to that moment, that was the first time he had forgiven him?
I don't know. I don't know.
Mm.
But when he told me that, he just sunk into his bed and he just closed his eyes and he cried. And at that same moment, he's gripping my hand like a vice because there's so much pain in his stomach. And he can't eat or drink anything because he just
Right.
immediately throws it back up. And nothing can go into his stomach. And they stopped giving him food a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not sure if he's starving to death at this moment as well as dying of dehydration. But he's in an enormous amount of pain, and the painkillers just seem not to be working. But I just saw that moment of relief in his eyes and in his whole body communicating something to me. And it gave me such a feeling of gratitude to be holding the hand of this dying guy. I didn't want to be anywhere else in the world at that moment.
That's pretty powerful, yeah.
I wanted to be right there. And so to then ask him, "What do you want to pray for?" And he's told me, "I want to pray for my dad. I want to pray for my mom. I want to pray for my wife." And he said, my wife was a druggie, and she tried to kill me in the first two times in the first 2 years of our marriage. And we stuck through it. And then after 40 years of marriage, he said, but golly,
Wow.
we love each
That's
other.
weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
On that forgiveness thing, have you ever heard of a guy named Dr. Fred Luskin?
No, I haven't. It doesn't come to mind.
I brought him up. He is a professor at Stanford, and he heads up a project called the Stanford Forgiveness Project. And he does lectures. You can find a lecture of his on YouTube easily. And it talks about, you could say, even the healing power, the power of forgiveness and how much it can give you. Like, you don't forgive someone to let them off the hook or to make them feel better. You forgive someone to release yourself. Just like you said, the weight had been lifted off of him.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard the saying, holding a grudge or a resentment is like taking poison and expecting the other person to die. And forgiveness is just stop drinking the poison. That just made me think of that. This guy that's got this program at Stanford, and maybe you'd want to watch one of his short lectures because it could give you a little. You can always use an extra arrow in your quill when you're trying to shoot down issues that people are struggling with.
I totally agree with that. Yeah, I've typed it into my computer to save it.
Wow, we've been talking an hour, dude.
It's flown by. I'll tell you what.
I have a zillion more questions. I never got to ask you about what your first month. I didn't get into the first month. We didn't get into that relationship that you sort of developed with that imam. I'd like to ask you about that if you're ever interested in doing this again.
Oh, yeah. No, there's a whole bunch more. There's a story of me as a high schooler forgetting my 12-year-old promise and thinking about where I'm going to go from here. So.
Oh, really? Okay.
Oh, yeah. There's lots. There's some fun times in my short life.
Awesome. Well, we will keep in touch. I will be in next week, but then I'm going on vacation, and you're graduating on Friday, right?
Yeah, I'm finishing the program on Friday.
It's been great working with you and getting to know you, and I hope we get to do this many more times throughout your career.
Whatever you got, I enjoy it. And there's lots of things that I don't know, but there's a fun kind of a conversation that I'm always enjoying with you, man.
Likewise. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with my friend from the seminary, and I will try to keep in touch with him and hopefully have him back. Now, since I have a couple of minutes, I'd like to tell you about a recent visit I made to a patient. I was on the floor walking along and came to a door that was closed and had a sign posted that before anyone entered, they should check with the attending nurse. This is not uncommon. I did and found out that it would be okay and that he seemed to be in a good mood that day as he had been doing Elmo impressions earlier.
Let's play peekaboo.
Not knowing exactly what that meant, I walked in and found a young man, probably in his 20s to early 30s, pretty long hair with a gauze mesh over his entire left leg due to a burn, and not much clothing other than that. His blanket was covering his, kibbles and bits, and he had an incarceration geo-tracker on his left ankle. Not much of a traditional conversation. And even though I'm a moron, I'm feeling like not only am I observing someone who could possibly be a meth addict to the point of permanent damage, I also have the very unprofessional feeling that I'm observing someone who could be schizophrenic. Also, he looked to be fairly healthy physically and lacked the gaunt look with accompanying sores and missing teeth that you would find with a meth addict. He seemed to have all of his teeth. How about that? They certainly weren't dentures, and if they were, he got ripped off. So which is it? Was it meth or schizophrenia? Well, I look it up, and gosh darn if there isn't some overlap between methamphetamine-induced psychosis and schizophrenia. How about that? There is a link to a study of just that at the bottom of the description if you're interested. It can be difficult without the proper educational background to make the distinction between someone who is suffering from crystal meth and someone who is schizophrenic. I was speaking with a new friend of mine who is in one of my exclusive social clubs that I've talked about, and he has recovered from addiction to meth and heroin. And he told me, based on his experience and not medical data or trials or anything professional, that someone on meth will hallucinate and see and interact with hallucinations, partially because the stimulant effect has kept them up for 4 or 5 or even 6 days. I cannot imagine that. And they are literally trying to sleep while awake, and it results in these hallucinations. Again, that is the experience of one person, not a science-based or clinically based conclusion. He also said that in his experience, the withdrawal from heroin was more physical, with an actual craving for the drug, while the withdrawal from meth was additionally psychological. Again, his experience. Also, with this guy, I noticed he had rather long fingernails, which I was slightly concerned about in case he got a little squirrely on me. I would not care to get scratched by this person. He did seem to respect that I was a chaplain. A lot of meth addicts really are into Jesus. He did have a Bible with him, and at one point asked me what was my favorite quote from the Bible. Well, I'm not that familiar with the Bible, so you want to know what this moron's answer was? I said, the Gospel of Matthew is the first thing that comes to mind. I mean, why limit myself to a favorite verse? I'll take the whole book. Thank you very much. So as I said, this guy was squirrely. He was a pretty cagey. In fact, that's a good word, cagey. Every couple of seconds, his eyes would shift, as could his mood. So I tried to wrap it up and still be respectful in having my talk with some prayer. He asked me to pray for him, and just like our seminarian recommended, I asked him, "What would you like me to pray for?" His response was, "I would like you to pray that I will be back with my wives and that I never test positive for crystal meth again." Not my wife, my wives, and not to be released from the grips of meth and its addiction. Just don't let me get caught. So you know what I did? I prayed for exactly that. Heavenly Father, please let Bob heal from his injuries so he can be reunited with his wives, and may he never ever test positive for crystal meth again. Oh, and also God, please release him from the grips of its addiction. I threw that last part in there so I'd have a clean conscience, you know what I mean? He told me that prayer was very powerful. I bid him goodbye, and as I left the room, he continued his conversation with his imaginary friends. Now, out of curiosity, if you have ever prayed for either of those things, to be reunited with your wives or to never test positive for meth again, would you please contact the Modern Moron, because we would love to hear your story. Finally, you might think to yourself, how can you be a chaplain and not know the Bible?
Folks, I'm a moron.
Well, my answer is that so far, the patients I have sat with mostly want someone to just listen. Listen to them. Ask about them. Inquire. Be curious about them. Listen to their story, which is always fascinating. Listen to their suffering and just be present. Not to come up with my own fish story or my tall tale that's going to one-up your story. And so far, that has been acceptable. But, I do have a lot to learn. Thank you for listening to these last 2 episodes that have been a bit different than we've had previously. Hit like and subscribe and write a glowing review and all the things people don't want to do when they listen to a podcast. Now that I think about it, skip it. I wouldn't do it either. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
There are 2 ways that I have defined forgiveness. The simplest is to simply say that no matter what has happened in any of our lives, at this moment we can be at peace. That forgiveness is the experience of being at peace right now, no matter what story, no matter what drama, no matter what has occurred 5 minutes ago or 5 years ago. And so I refer to forgiveness as an assertive, a creation of peace in the present. The second aspect of it, that's the most simple and that's the easiest for people to grasp. That the second part of it is that we are the ones who created the lack of peace. So we're the only ones who can remedy that situation. That life happened, and then we objected to life. And it was our objecting to our own life, saying, no, this is not the way this life should have been. It should have been that way. Our objecting to our own life causes emotional and physical and spiritual turmoil. Forgiveness is the resolution of our objection. It really has nothing to do with life or the people in it, because life just happens in all of its myriad of experiences and arisings, and we object to part of it. So forgiveness is, in that context, again, it's making peace when you didn't get what you want.